Well, ladies, welcome. In the studio today, I have Maddie, and we are starting a brand new series called Women of the Old Testament, Stories That Changed History. So I'm really excited to unpack Sarah with you today, Maddie. That's who we're going to talk about. And I think with all of these stories, what our hope in this series is that we want women to understand some key players in the Old Testament. Because I think a lot of people are intimidated by the Old Testament. They don't read it, so they don't really know. But the truth is, there is a story from Genesis to Revelation. And we need to understand the whole story to really understand who Jesus is and all that he came to do for us. So today we're going to talk about Sarah. So Maddie, for me, Sarah was a great challenge of a woman that had some really great highlights in her life, but she also had some lowlights, but somehow God still chose to use her. What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're kind of the same way. When I first read it and I read her story, I thought, first of all, this is a crazy story.
Yes.
And it's not really something that I would probably ever experience, but it's also surprisingly relatable.
That's right.
It's one of those really great Old Testament stories that is relatable for
today. We might as well be a woman in 2017. I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so with all of the lessons in this series, we're going to ask some important questions. And the first question that we're answering is, how does Sarah fit into the story of the whole Bible? Because again, I think it's important for women to understand, like, okay, well, so where does Sarah fit into the story of the Bible, and why do we care about her, or how is she a part of changing history? So for Sarah, we got to go all the way back to Genesis. And Sarah is married to Abraham. And in the beginning of Genesis, Abram was his name, but God changes his name later on. So from now on, I'm just going to call him Abraham. But after the flood, after Noah, after the Tower of Babel, which are maybe some stories that women are familiar with, here comes this guy named Abraham. And God comes to him and gives him a huge conversation about some really key promises that set up the rest of the story of the Bible. So I just want to read from the passage and then we'll talk about it. So from Genesis 12, this is what God says to Abraham. The Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. Those are pretty intense promises, right?
Yeah.
So what God is saying here is, Abraham, I'm going to give you land. I'm going to give you lots of descendants, lots of kids, and all people on earth are going to be blessed through you. Mm-hmm. Now, when you read the Bible and you get to Jesus, you realize that from the line of Abraham is Jesus, and he is the blessing to all people. So we will see throughout the story of the Bible that God fulfills every single one of these promises. But this is where Sarah comes into play. She's married to Abraham, who's the key player here.
Yeah. So those promises are amazing, but yeah, God asked them to do some pretty scary things. And so, Sarah had to leave her relatives and everything that she knew and go to a foreign land. Like, that's scary, and that's a sacrifice.
Right.
And then she also went through some confusion because God promised her a child, and she's like way past childbearing age.
Past. That's right.
And so, yeah, that's kind of a burden on her, I'm sure.
Yes.
And so,
yes. They were old. Let's be honest. They were very old.
Yes.
Okay, so in order to understand more of her story, let's then answer the question, what was Sarah's story? So who was Sarah?
Sarah was, well, first of all, her name means my princess. And it's believed that she was a little bit of a pampered princess.
Ooh. Okay.
But she was also very beautiful. One of my favorite stories is when Abraham and Sarah traveled to Egypt, and he asked her to pretend to be his sister because she was so beautiful he was afraid they were going to kill him for being married to her.
Bump him off so they could have her.
Yeah, she was beautiful.
Okay, right. So, we know she was kind of a pampered princess. I think that's interesting insight. We also know that she had to have been pretty brave, because I don't know about you, but I did move away from family many years ago, and that was one of the hardest things I've ever done, to leave all the streets I knew were the restaurants that I liked, and to leave and to go start a new life. So Sarah had to be pretty brave to do that. But we also know that Sarah's desire was to have kids. And like we're learning, she's very old, and she knows of these promises that God has made to Abraham about many descendants, and yet she's looking at herself saying, I don't have any kids. What am I supposed to do? So I imagine there was a lot of stress on her carrying the burden of, I'm standing in the way of what God said he was going to do. So as we learn in Sarah's story, she ends up taking matters into her own hands and tries to play God and says, hey, Abraham, I'm not able to have kids, but how about you take my maidservant Hagar and have a child with her, and then maybe those will be our descendants. And he does have a child, Ishmael, with Hagar, which causes all sorts of trouble.
Yeah.
So what else do we know about Sarah?
Yeah, so after that happens, she actually has her own child at 90 years old.
At 90.
Yeah, and his name is Isaac, which means to laugh. So she had a sense of humor about it, which is great.
Yes, that's true.
But yeah, so that happened. God fulfilled that promise. And then also we learned that Sarah was the only woman in the Bible to have her name changed by God. So her name was Sarai, and now her name is Sarah. And she's also the woman mentioned the most in the Bible, which is pretty cool.
Which is pretty amazing, as we both have said about Sarah's story, that even though she made mistakes, she and Abraham lie about who she is. She tells Abraham to take a maidservant, and then she's mad and bitter and jealous about that. But yet, she's also mentioned in the Bible more than any other woman, and she was known for a woman of faith. And so that leads into this next question that we want to answer is, what can we learn from Sarah's story? Well, what I've learned from Sarah's story is that she was a mixed bag, like me. I think Sarah had some highlights and some lowlights. She was brave and stepped out and went where God asked her to go, to an unfamiliar place. She showed faith in God. She was known for her faith throughout history. But she also showed a lot of impatience, a lack of trust, a lack of understanding how big God is and how little she was, that she had bitterness and jealousy when she wasn't getting the things that she wanted and saw that other people had it. And yet, despite all of that God still viewed her as a woman of faith and gave her a place of honor. And in Sarah's life, by the end of her life, she really understood who God was and worshiped him for being powerful and able to give her a child at 90 years old, and she could laugh about it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, and yeah, God took that, and she, like you said earlier, she ended up having Isaac, who had Jacob, who had
right, the 12 tribes
on Jesus.
Right,
and
that's right.
That's incredible that God was able to still take her life and do amazing things with it.
Yeah, and she really did change history. And where do we find her in the New Testament? Where is that a key place that we see Sarah's name?
Yeah, we see her mentioned in Hebrews 11, which is like the Faith Hall of Fame.
Right.
She's
the people of great faith, known for great faith. Sarah's in there along with Abraham. And it wasn't just through Abraham, it was her own names in there, which I think is pretty cool.
Gone down in history.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the other piece of Sarah's story too, what would you say about God's grace? How does that show up in her life?
So I think God just took her life and her mistakes and basically kind of showed off. He's like, look what I can still do with your life. You know, I am powerful, and I love you, and you're faithful still. And so here, you know, I'm going to fulfill these promises that I promised you, even though, you know, she obviously had some moments where she was lacking faith.
That's great. I know. And I think that that's the thing. Here's the statement we're going to end every video with in this series, and that is that God can use your story to change history. Maddie, that God can use your story and mine and any woman out there, that God can use us to change the course of history too. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, in my life, I also left Tennessee and moved to Utah really randomly. I just felt like God wanted me in Utah, and so I just took that leap of faith, and from doing that, God has completely changed my life. You know, I got married. I didn't think I was going to get married so soon. Like, he sent me a husband, and he sent me an amazing community of friends and these mentoring relationships. And none of this would have happened had I not taken that step of faith and moved to Utah. And so I think that's just an amazing testimony, again, of what God can do in our lives when we just take one simple step.
Right. And why don't you read that passage from Jeremiah chapter 9 that kind of speaks exactly to what you just described?
This is what the Lord says: don't let the wise boast in their wisdom, or the powerful boast in their power, or the rich boast in their riches. But those who wish to boast should boast in this alone, that they truly know me and understand that I am the Lord, who demonstrates unfailing love and who brings justice and righteousness to the earth, and that I delight in these things.
Yeah, to me, what's so powerful, and I think what we can learn from Sarah's story in terms of how God used her to change history, is just how big and awesome that God is, and that he doesn't seek wisdom from us. He doesn't need us to intervene. and that all we can do really is just boast in who he is and his power and his authority to do what he says he's going to do. And even though for Sarah, she could have learned along the way and probably saved herself a lot of pain and sorrow from inserting herself and trying to play God, in the end, she was teachable. In the end, she did worship God for who he was and understood that it was his power that made those promises come through. Like we learned that she was 90 years old. And that God wants to do something in our lives as well. And his power is true for us too. And that we can celebrate not only who God is and get to know that God and his power and his authority and his love for us, but we can also marvel at his grace, that he turns our weaknesses, our struggles, our mistakes, and can turn them into something to change the course of history, our stories, our families, our friends, the trajectory of our life. And so let's just remember that from Sarah's story, and let's remember that that same God who intervened in Sarah's life wants to intervene in ours. So Maddie, thanks for being here today and for unpacking Sarah. And ladies, as with all of our resources, use those questions below, have a conversation with your small group or a mentor, and we do have homework with this series. Take some time to do that, more self-reflection, to think some more on Sarah. But we hope you enjoyed our time with Sarah, and we'll see you in the next video.